All right, so this name comes from the fact that it's taking place in photosynthesis, and we are fixing an oxygen. So like respiration, which takes in an oxygen, but with photosynthesis instead. And so we're not going to go through the pathway for how this works or how the plant deals with this, but instead we're going to talk about some different adaptations that groups of plants have evolved to deal with this problem. And so quite a few plants are what are called C3 plants, and these plants actually don't have a very good way of dealing with this issue of rubisco. And so lots of agricultural plants are C3 plants, including lots of the ones that are grown in this area in the Central Valley. So for example, almond, tomato, grapes, and rice are all C3 plants. And so in our C3 plants, we're going to be doing this photorespiration process. And so we have some consequences of that. So one of those is that they are less efficient at higher temperatures. But as we'll see by comparison to some of the other mechanisms, they actually need the least amount of ATP per carbon fixed. All right, so now we'll talk about two different mechanisms that plants have evolved to address this issue of photorespiration. So the first mechanism is called C4. And before I get into that, let me just kind of explain where that name C3 comes from. And so it's just referring to kind of that first stable product that you get after the CO2 is incorporated. And so it's that 3-carbon sugar at the beginning of the cycle. And C4 plants, again, that's referring to the first stable product, which is going to be a 4-carbon sugar. So C4. So basically, both of these mechanisms are strategies that the plants have evolved to prevent rubisco, the enzyme, from coming into contact with oxygen. So this first mechanism, C4, is a physical separation of rubisco from oxygen. And so what this looks like, so here this will be sort of a normal cell in a plant leaf that's going to be exposed to the gases that are coming into the leaf. And so in this cell we'll have CO2 coming in. And then that CO2 is going to be fixed, not by rubisco, but by a different enzyme, which we'll call PEP. And so it's going to add that to a 4-carbon acid. So this is why this is called C4 photosynthesis, is because the first molecule that we get after we add CO2 has 4 carbons. And so then this 4-carbon acid is then going to be transported to a neighboring cell that is basically sealed off from gases. So gases that enter the leaf can't actually get to this cell. So we'll head into this cell. And now we've got our 4-carbon sugar. And then another enzyme is going to remove the CO2 from the 4-carbon sugar. So now that CO2 can go in and be used in the Calvin cycle. And then to complete the cycle, we have now a 3-carbon acid because we pulled the carbon dioxide off of the 4-carbon molecule. And now that's going to go back out to the other cell. And to regenerate our starting molecule here, we're actually going to need to use some ATP. And so you can see that this is extra ATP that these C4 plants need to use to do their carbon fixation process. And so the C3 plants that I showed you don't do this. And so that means for each carbon that is being fixed in the Calvin cycle in these C4 plants, they have to use some extra ATP and NADPH. So that's an extra energy cost. So you might wonder, like, why do that? What's the advantage? So one of the advantages is that because these plants are more efficient with their Calvin cycle, because oxygen is not getting to rubisco, it means that they don't need to bring as much gas into their leaves. So let's say this is a surface of a leaf here. And so in leaves, there are openings called stomata, which is how gas gets into the leaf. So when the stomata are open, that's how our CO2 and oxygen and nitrogen and all sorts of other stuff that's in the atmosphere, that's how that gets into the leaf. But the problem with that is that when those pores, those stomata, are open, water can evaporate out. So water evaporating out of the leaves is part of normal plant physiology. It's actually how plants transport nutrients from the soil up through the roots of the leaves. And so you have to have some water leaving. But if you're a plant living in a place like the Central Valley, particularly in July and August when it's 100 degrees, you're going to have lots and lots of evaporation of water out of your leaves if these pores are open all the time. And so C4 plants, because they need to take in less gas, because they're more efficient, they can keep their stomata closed more of the time, and that reduces evaporation. And so the consequence for that is that our C4 plants are going to be more water efficient.